Hello again, everyone. It's funny, I wasn't originally going to do a part two of this. I listened back to the first part and I actually wasn't very happy with the way it came out. The main problem I had with it was that it was just too long. It was taking me too long to get to my critique. I had originally written this out as a very long blog post almost 2 years ago, and it's taking me much longer to do the video. I thought it was just going to be a summary of the blog post, but I'm actually embellishing on it much more. And I didn't want this to be basically a summary of the entire book. I wanted to focus it more on the critique. So I actually made the video private, and I was just like, you know what, I'm not even going to bother doing it. There's already plenty of explanations of the theory online that you can read. There's already plenty of YouTube videos. So I figured you could read my blog post if you want to read my critique. I think it is much more succinct, and it explains it much better than I could possibly do it in this verbal YouTube video. So I left it as is. But then this whole thing came out where it was revealed that Steve Bannon was greatly inspired by Strauss and Howe's generational theory. And now all of a sudden, it's all over the news. Neil Howe's doing interviews on CBS, and suddenly everyone's talking about it. So I feel like I have an obligation to talk about the theory and continue this. And also, I also had to reevaluate how much the theory inspired me. For those of you who have watched some of the other videos on my channel, you might know that I'm sort of a semi-amateur musician. I started writing a concept album when I was about 16 years old. It was called Dracus, and it was a 20-minute progressive rock epic. Way, way too ambitious for my 16-year-old self. But I had this huge concept in my head about this dragon that comes every 100 years or so, destroys the world, brings chaos. Basically, he represents chaos, and it forces the civilization to rebuild. Now, keep in mind, I was 16 years old. I loved history, but I had never read or heard about Strauss and Howe generational theory. But I did have this idea of historical cycles in my head at the time. Now, come 2011, I read Strauss and Howe generational theory in the fourth turning and in generations, and I'm like, wow, this is actually something that really deeply inspired me. And I didn't even know it. But I wrote new songs. I added new songs to it and changed lyrics around a bit, in part inspired by reading Strauss and Howe. So, yeah, it is very inspiring. There's something about the idea of historical cycles that is extremely interesting. The idea that you can sort of predict where things are going and maybe even have an effect to change it. And I think that's kind of what Steve Bannon was inspired by. For now, I want to focus on the theory and my critiques of it. And we'll continue where we left off. So I said last time that every generation correlates with the turning. So the awakening generation correlates with the Augustan Age of Empire, and the Liberty generation correlates with the Great Awakening. But the years are actually a little bit different. These years printed here are actually the years that the generation begins and ends. So the millennial generation begins in 1982 and ends in 2004. The actual turnings are actually a few years later. So the awakening, the second turning of our current millennial cycle, actually began in 1964 when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So it actually begins a few years after Generation X began. And the third turning began in 1984 with Reagan's Morning in America. Every turning begins with a turning point in history. It's usually a specific event. It's basically what shifts the mood of the country. So, for example, the assassination of John F. Kennedy shifted the country from a first turning high to a second turning awakening. Someone in the baby boom generation has a memory of what the first turning was like before John F. Kennedy was assassinated. But someone in Generation X does not. So the oldest members of Generation X were born in 1961. So they were only 3 years old when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Those are the very oldest members of Generation X. So they have very hazy memories at best of what the mood of the first turning was like. But someone who was born in 1960, they were 4. They also have very hazy memories. But by the time you've hit the age of 4, you've officially entered childhood. And your mind is kind of developed where you're actually forming real memories. I mean, when I was 3, I was sort of forming memories. I could remember things when I was 3, but I don't really think I have really vivid memories of things until I was 4. I don't know if that's how it is for everyone. I'm sure some people have more vivid memories of when they were younger. Some people don't remember things until they were 5 or 6. I know my cousin doesn't remember anything before 1999, and he's only a few years younger than me. I know it's a little weird, and this is actually one of my major critiques, is how like someone who was born in 1960 is a whole different generation than someone who was born in 1961. Yet someone who was born in 1980 is the same generation as someone who was born in 1961. And to further complicate things, the fourth turning is actually broken up into 4 separate phases. You've got the first phase, which begins with the catalyst. This is actually the event that sparks the crisis. You could think of this as kind of like the red pill moment, in which everyone realizes that things have gone to hell. Now, I'm actually going to say that a lot of times crises have multiple red pill moments, and it's kind of like a cascading effect, because not everyone sort of wakes up and realizes everything's gone to hell. Usually it takes a series of events, and I think actually this crisis is one such example. Strauss and Howe believes that our current crisis began in 2008, the financial crisis. Not everyone agrees with that, though. Some people believe it started in 2001 with 9/11. Others believe it started with Katrina, and some believe it started after 2008. Occupy Wall Street. We also had Black Lives Matter and other movements like smaller online movements like Gamergate, things like that. All the gates. How many gates have we had in the last 10 years or so? I think we broke the record in number of gates in the last few years. Some believe it started as late as Trump's election. I think a lot of times, and this is true of most crises, and I think it's actually very true of the Civil War crisis, is that there's actually several red pill moments. There's several moments where things just happen, where just everyone's just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Everyone just wakes up. But Strauss and Howe just pick one catalyst based on the position that it occurs according to the generational constellation. So 9/11 2001 probably would have been a great catalyst, but the millennial generation was still too young, Generation X was still too young, and the baby boomers were still too young. And basically, we just weren't old enough yet. The country was still too strong. We weren't quite unraveled enough yet. So it really was just an unraveling event, kind of like what World War I was for us back in 1914. It was a very big unraveling event. 9/11 and the wars that followed. And those wars continued well into the crisis, the fourth turning. Just kind of like World War I was. World War I was a third turning war that ended in the third turning, but it didn't really resolve the problems, and it led us to World War II. And as for the catalyst moments that occur after the main catalyst begins, some of those might be better described as the second phase, which is actually called the regeneracy. This is the counter entropy, which groups start forming to try and fix the problem. This reunifies and engages civic life. So you could kind of think of this, at least in our current crisis, the Tea Party was one such regeneracy, the Tea Party forming in reaction to the financial crisis. But then Occupy Wall Street. A lot of people thought of that as the left's reaction to the financial crisis. Tea Party was the right's reaction. Occupy Wall Street was the left's reaction. Then we had Trump's election, which was kind of the right's reaction to the left's reaction. So there was about several reactions to reactions going on there. And then you have number 3, which is the climax. This is the moment of great danger, the crucial moment that confirms the death of the old order and the birth of the new. Total war often happens during the climax. A lot of times, Strauss and Howe like to use the Great Depression and World War II as a perfect example of this, of a crisis where you had the catalyst being the stock market crash of 1929, followed by the regeneracy, the New Deal, and then the climax being World War II, of course. And then the final phase, the resolution, a triumphant or tragic conclusion that separates the winners from the losers, resolves big public questions, and establishes the new order. So this is basically the end of the crisis. There has to be a winner. There's usually 2 sides. Like I said, there's 2 sides to every Schwartz. World War II, we were all on the same side. In America, we were fighting the Germans and the Japanese and the Axis powers. But then we had the Cold War after that, so it wasn't completely finished, and that left us open to fighting new battles. But it did resolve that one conflict, at least. Civil War was more of an internal battle where we were fighting ourselves, but it did resolve the issue of slavery, which had been the major issue of that entire cycle. So this cycle, I think, has been mostly a battle between ideologies of left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, globalism versus nationalism, federalism versus anti-federalism, the oldest battle of the country. I think it's coming down to a battle of ideas in terms of kind of like it's almost like socialism versus capitalism. And I feel like we're coming to terms with that. Like we've kind of gone in a neoliberal, neoconservative direction, and now we're coming to terms with how that's kind of brought us too far to the brink of spending and debt and corruption, and now we're trying to reverse that, and we're dealing with trying to fix that. And then we have this whole battle with left and right. Which side is the good side? The left or the right? Or are they both evil? Are they both good? This is kind of reaching its tipping point now with Trump. So those are the 4 phases. And I think we're pretty much getting to the end of the summary, but there are some charts that are very interesting to look at. These are the moods of the 4 turning for each of the archetypes. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can always read the book if you're really interested, but I do want to talk about a few of them. In the first turning, families are strong, and in the second turning, they're weakening. Third turning, they're weak, and in the fourth turning, they're strengthening again. This stuff is interesting. I don't know how true this is, especially to our own crisis that we're going through now. I don't know. This might only be to the past crises, but, some of this stuff I think actually is true. Child nurture is loosening during a first turning, underprotective during a second turning, tightening during a third turning, and overprotective during a fourth turning. So you could think of that. Think of how children are it makes sense how during a crisis period they're being overprotective. Think about how children are kind of overprotective now, and how like the millennials were kind of like everyone was giving a trophy because they were starting to be overprotective. But the nomads were underprotected. They were the latchkey kids. And the baby boomers during the first turning, they were the kids, they were kind of increasingly indulged. So that, I think, is definitely true. Gap between gender roles. It's maximum during a first turning, narrowing during a second turning. This is basically how different men and women are, their roles. Like housewife, the breadwinner. The father's the breadwinner. Think about the 50s. That was definitely true, maximum. Narrowing during a second turning. Okay, so now you have women and men. That was the second wave feminism and everything. Third turning, minimum. So now we have the beginning of third wave feminism. Fourth turning, crisis. Gap between gender roles is widening. Think of the backlash against third wave feminism that you see going on now. Definitely true. And here you have the archetypes of the generations and how they behave throughout their life. And I'm not going to go through each one of these. You could basically just look at the chart and read each of these here yourself. Here are each of the generations throughout history. If you notice, Civil War did not have a generation. I'll talk about that probably in the next video. Most of the things in this chart I talked about in the last video, but one thing I forgot to mention is that the generation isn't raised only by the generation prior. It's raised by a combination of the two generations prior. So the artist raises the prophet and the nomad. Okay? They raise the second half of the prophets and the first half of the nomads. And the prophets raise the second half of the nomads and the first half of the hero generation. And the hero generation raises the second half of the artist generation and the first half of the prophet. And according to Strauss and Howe, it's the generation 2 steps away from the generation that raises it that sets the tone for how that generation is going to be raised. So the hero's kind of the mirror image of the prophet, and the artist is kind of the mirror image of the nomad. And you could sort of see it in this chart. Nomads were underprotected as kids. Artists were overprotected as kids. But the way they raised their own kids was just the opposite, sort of making up for the way they were raised. They wanted to say, I'm not going to raise my kids the way I was raised. So nomads were very overprotective of their children, their artist children. They sort of set the tone for the way artists were raised. And the artists set the tone for the way nomads were raised by being very underprotective. Heroes and prophets are a little bit more similar to each other, I think, because their childhoods were during transitionary periods when overprotection was either during a tightening phase or during a relaxing phase. In the case of prophets, tightening phase. Heroes were generally viewed as good, outer world building, hubristic rather than narcissistic like the prophets were. They were indulged. They were spirited because they were growing up at a time when people felt kids should be let free to do what they want. Whereas heroes were growing up at a time when people felt that kids should be more protected. So nurturing was tightening rather than relaxing. So that's kind of why these archetypes were kind of mirror images of each other. But the interesting thing is, too, that their voting patterns kind of alternated. Now, I'm talking statistically. Every generation was split between Republican and Democrat. You know, it wasn't that all heroes voted Democrat, all artists voted Republican. No, statistically, they were all split. They were all divided between Republican and Democrat. But statistically, hero generations tend to vote Democrat. Artist generations tend to vote Republican. Prophet generations tend to vote Democrat. And nomad generations tend to vote Republican. And this has just been shown statistically since the Lost generation. The Lost generation tended to be a generation that voted Republican in most elections. GI generation tended to vote Democrat. The silent generation tended to vote Republican. In fact, the silent majority was sort of named after them. The baby boom generation tended to vote Democrat. The older baby boom generation, especially the younger baby boomers, the ones that were born in the mid to late 50s, were a little bit more conservative. Same with the older generation X. The ones that came of age during the Reagan era tend to be a lot more conservative. I guess you could consider them the Alex P. Keatons of the world. Contrast that with the Generation X members that came of age during the Clinton era. They're a lot more liberal. They tend to vote Democrat. But overall, Generation X was more of a Republican voting generation. And then millennials are very much a Democrat voting generation. They voted overwhelmingly for Obama. There's a lot of people saying that Generation Z, which I think is the cusp of millennial Homelander cusp, is leaning more conservative right now. That was actually a documentary that Steve Bannon wrote, was Generation Zero, the younger millennials, the next generation after millennials. But I like to refer to the cusp between millennial and Homelander as Generation Z. Why don't we talk about the cusps now? Because I keep talking about this. This is actually something that Strauss and Howe don't talk about. They don't mention cusps at all in the book. And I think the reason they don't is because they're so focused on this idea of the turning point of history. And because their theory relies so much on these turnings, the generations actually change on a dime. Personally, I find that ridiculous. It's actually probably my biggest critique of the whole theory. I think generations change gradually. Cusps exist, and it's a gradual change. Yeah, turning points do have an effect, but they're not that important. I think a lot of times those turning points are chosen arbitrarily because they fit the pattern well, and it's just as easy to pick another turning point in history. Like you could say Nixon's resignation was a big turning point, but because it happened at an inconvenient time, right in the middle of what seemed like an awakening, they couldn't pick it, you know? So that's why I think cusps have to exist. And when we were discussing on the forums, we actually identified 5 such cusps. One was the interbellum generation. Those were those born circa 1900. That's actually the year that the GI generation began. So it's the cusp in between the Lost and the GI generation. The greatest generation. Oftentimes the GI generation is referred to as the greatest generation. But when people refer to the greatest generation, they don't usually go as far back as 1900. They usually just refer to people born between 1915 and 1927 or so. So I like to refer to the greatest generation as a cusp, born circa 1925, as the greatest generation. So that's kind of like a GI silent cusp. War baby generation. These were people born around the time of World War II, born circa 1944, the silent generation and the baby boomer cusp. And then there's Generation Jones, referred to because they were always keeping up with the Joneses, the late wave boomers, early wave Xers, born circa 1961. And then my cusp, Generation Y. Now, oftentimes the millennial generation was referred to as Generation Y, but that was usually just the early part of the millennial generation that was referred to as Generation Y. Why bother? It was often referred to Generation Y bother. So I like to refer to just the cusp, those born circa 1982, which is the first year of the millennial generation. This was the cusp, the end of Generation X, the beginning of the millennial generation. And, of course, Generation Z. At first, when I put this down, I actually had beginning dates and end dates, and it was very arbitrary to pick beginning and end dates. But then I realized putting beginning and end dates on cusps defeats the purpose of cusps. The whole idea of cusps is that it's a gradual shift from one generation to the next. So that's why I just put 1 year, and it's around that year. It actually fades into the next generation. But what I have noticed when I did try to put those dates in is that the previous generation tends to have more of a lasting effect into the next generation. So for example, Generation Y tends to fade out as late as like 1988, but starts only around the time of like 1977, and maybe even later than that, maybe 1978. So it tends to lean more into the generation. And I think the reason for that is because of the turning point. The turning point is actually a few years after the generation starts, remember? Because I think it was, 1984 that it starts. So that actually makes sense. So we identified the cusps, at least going back to the interbellum period. Now, the next step, obviously, was to come up with the archetypes for these cusps. Obviously, if there was a pattern for the main generations, there had to be a repeating pattern for these cusp generations. So I decided, just for the fun of it, and because I'm a total nerd, as you could probably tell already, to try and define the cusp archetypes. I wanted to try to do the same thing that Strauss and Howe did, come up with these fun names, these mystical names. I basically did something like Bob Dylan. I came up with 4 names: the King, the Joker, the Prince, and the Thief. Joker and the Thief, and then Princes. I went all along the Watchtower. The King I just sort of made up. King and the Prince. If you notice, they mirror each other. King and Prince kind of mirrors each other, kind of like the hero and prophet, and Joker and Thief kind of mirrors each other, kind of like artist and nomad. And that's kind of what I was going for, because they are very similar in a way. And so here it is, the King. We'll start with the King. The King is a hero artist cusper. The King enters childhood at a time when the shift of parenting towards increasing protectiveness has already been underway for some time, so they have no memory of a time when children were left largely underprotected and without supervision. From a very early age, they are encouraged to be busy and active high achievers in their community and are not accustomed to free time to indulge in themselves. Coming of age late in the crisis, they become the youthful relief agents of the older generations and are encouraged to stay positive and make sacrifices to guide society out of the crisis. When I wrote that, I was thinking about how these were the younger hero generation guys that kind of were replacements in World War II, the relief agents. Coming of age during the climax in the fourth turning, many will find themselves as the low-ranking boots on the ground of the great conflict. And many of them were, because some of them were old enough to fight in the war. This could be tragic or glorious, depending on the outcome, and the survivors on the losing side may be demonized for the rest of their lives. Think about the ones on the losing side of the war: Civil War, the Confederates, or the Nazis in the case of World War II. Those that survive as the victors maintain a very positive and optimistic attitude throughout their lives. They are usually the most active and dominant cohort group in building the new institutions at the end of the crisis and during the high. They are rewarded well for their efforts well into adulthood and usually maintain the longest period of leadership roles while they are elders. While optimistic for most of their lives, they eventually succumb to despair in old age as they lose their ability to remain active and witness all they have helped build fall apart at the dawning of the next crisis. They maintain the hubris and optimism of heroes with the conformity and helpfulness of artists. Example, the Greatest Generation and Generation Z. So there's some sadness there and some greatness there. They have potential to be great throughout the rest of their lives, or they have the potential to come to a tragic end. When you compare my descriptions of the archetypes, my descriptions tend to be a lot more dark. I think I can go into a lot more extremes than Strauss and Howe are willing to go into. But I don't know. Remember, this is just a bit of fun. This is not a science. Don't take it seriously. I'm just making this up. I'm just pulling it right out of my butt. Strauss and Howe have more credibility. They did a lot more research than I did. They were basing it a lot more on biographical evidence. I still don't think what they did was a science either, but it is very interesting. But saying that, let's move on to the next one. This is the Joker. The Joker is an artist prophet cusper. The Joker enters childhood at a time when the crisis is ending. So their memories of the crisis, though often powerful and even traumatic, are sparse. Too young to offer much help in the immediate rebuilding, the Joker's role is often viewed as less important to the structure, but extremely valuable to the heart of the new regime. They often serve as the most celebrated entertainers and artists throughout the High and into the Awakening. They are less conformist than their older siblings and often set the tone for inner exploration that the prophet later adopts in the Awakening. They question and criticize the new institutions, but do it more in a constructive way than the later prophets. Theirs is an effort to improve the new king's regime, rather than tear it down as the later prophets would have. As they age, they often change their minds and can offer a completely different message than they had previously offered, but ironically become more preachy and more stubborn in their viewpoint each time they do. They maintain the artistic qualities and constructive nature of artists, while also embracing the radical viewpoints and preachiness of prophets. An example from today is the war babies. These are the people that were born around the time of World War II. When I wrote this, I was thinking about Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Monty Python crew, basically all of those musicians that came out in the 60s, Mel Brooks, some of the people that really inspired me. There are elders right now, actually. I think when we think of artists, we often think of the jokers, the ones born at the end of the artist period, not so much the ones born at the beginning, the king. We usually think of the joker archetype. And you'll notice that pattern too, because when I was describing the king archetype, I seem to describe more the hero than I do the artist. Same with the joker. I seem to describe more the artist than I do the hero. And that's what I was saying before, how the traits of the previous generation seem to lean more into the next generation when we're talking about cusps. Now, there's one thing I'm thinking of changing is the whole thing. As they age, they often change their minds and can offer a completely different message than they had previously offered, but ironically become more preachy and more stubborn in their viewpoint each time they do. I think everyone does that. Might take that out, actually, because you just learn more as you get older. That's definitely describes how they are now, but we're all like that in a way, I think. The prophets are the preachers, but I think the joker that sets the tone for that preachiness. When you think about the folk rock movement and all that, and the hippie movement, it was really started by the joker archetype. When you think of Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary, all silent generation, all that late wave, that joker war baby cusp. Let's move on to the next. The prince. The prince is a prophet nomad cusper. The prince enters childhood at a time when restrictions and protectiveness have laxed, and children have become increasingly indulged. Spoiled while young, they are often seen as unpleasant by adults, and are increasingly neglected and unwanted as they age. As a result, they feel a disconnect from older generations and a strong desire to prove themselves. Now, remember how I mentioned Veruca Salt? Veruca Salt is this age group, this late wave baby boomer. Think about when Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory came out. All those kids were late wave baby boomers. Now, you might say that it's not fair to judge a generation's personality by fictional characters like Veruca Salt and Dennis the Menace and Pinocchio. But it's actually, fictional characters is a great way to judge a generation's personality, because that's how they're depicted by society, by the culture. Because this is what the people in that age group were depicted like at that time in that culture. So it's actually a good indication of what that personality was like. Because remember, these are stereotypes that let's not kid ourselves when we're talking about these. They can be rebellious youths, valuing fame and popularity over academic and social achievements. They adopt their own set of values, and many of them preach them vigorously. Like the king, the prince is a high achiever, but is more competitive rather than community-oriented. They vigorously compete with their peers for fame, fortune, and recognition. Keeping up with the Joneses. There you go. In entertainment, they strive for fame and popularity. In business, they value personal recognition and achievement. In family life, they pursue perfection and do their best to stay ahead of their peers. But many of them do grow out of this, and as elders, they often become regretful of their past indulgences and seek to make amends by sacrificing their wealth for society. I think of like Bill Gates and Madonna and all of these late wave baby boomers that are early Generation X that are, giving to charity and doing all these things. Still, they often want recognition for it. Nevertheless, some of the best accomplishments for society were made by princes. They maintain the narcissism of prophets with the individual survivalism of nomads. Good example are Jonesers. So I think I talked enough about them. Now the thief. Now if you notice the thief, the longest paragraph because I happen to be the thief. I'm the thief archetype. So I know the most about the thief. And oh, the struggle the thief has. The thief is a nomad hero cusper. The thief enters childhood at a time when society is beginning to crack down on individual excesses, risk-taking, and the bad behavior of the nomads. Unlike their successors, the kings, they have early memories of a time when children were given more freedom to do what they want without supervision, but found themselves denied such freedoms as they grew up. I'm just remembering when I learned to ride a bicycle at 6 years old and I didn't have to wear a helmet. And then at 13 years old, there's that law and I have to wear a helmet. And I'm remembering when my older sisters got to high school and it was an open campus. But when I got to high school, they closed the campus. Oh, just annoying. Okay. Embittered by the increasing restrictions placed on them, thieves often rebel against authority and cynically reject the preachiness of the older generations. Often prone to bad behavior, law-breaking, bullying, violence, and escapism amid a society that is increasingly trying to structure their lives. Escapism. Remember, World of Warcraft sucked into that for a long time. The thief is probably the most troubled of the cuspers. Coming of age, the thief withdraws from society, attempting to indulge in the freedoms and pleasure denied to him as he grew up. This period of pleasure-seeking is cut short, however, by the arrival of the next crisis. Taking a cue from the younger and better-behaved hero, the thief usually finds himself joining forces with new movements. During the crisis Total War, thieves often make great mid-ranking officers because they can relate to both the older nomads in the higher ranks and the younger heroes in the lower ranks. But the thief's innate distrust of authority can still get them into trouble when they do try to stay loyal to one side. Benedict Arnold, born right on the thief cusp year in 1741, comes to mind. Everyone knows who Benedict Arnold is. He's the one that betrayed George Washington in the Revolutionary War. Too young to be a leader and too old to be a naive recruit, the thief often feels like an outsider. Alternatively, in order to survive, the thief will adopt the hero's optimism and communal spirit, but will never completely lose his skepticism. With all things group-oriented, there's always that strong nomad streak in him. Example, the Interbellum and Generation Y. And once again, the thief describes more the nomad than it does the hero, because the hero is really the king. The king. And I think that's what I'm writing here. The interesting thing about these cusp identities is that it's the generation that is ending that more directly fits with the identity of the cusp, not the one that is beginning. For example, the thief description describes the nomad more than it does the hero. The king description describes the hero more than it does the artist. The joker description describes the artist more than it does the prophet, and the prince description describes the prophet more than it does the nomad. I think the reason is that the generation's gradual development of its personality builds towards these cusping moments until it reaches such an extreme that the course changes and becomes something different. The cusp is the turning point, A generation's personality starts going in a different direction during these cusping years. The people who were born during that turning point represent the extremes of the ending generation, but also start to show signs of the new generational personality. I think that just sums it up right there. The whole idea of the cusps. But you have to remember the archetypes. What does it actually do? Does it just overcomplicate things? Because now we have 8 archetypes. Before we only had 4. Do we really need 8? All I'm doing is I'm basically restating what they said in a way. It's not really adding much to the theory. I guess the answer is no. We don't really need them. But I think you just need the idea of cusps. You need to know that it doesn't change on the dime, that there is something in between. There is a personality in between generations, if generations exist at all. Because I think this whole idea of generations to begin with is very much an abstract thing to begin with. So if you are going to believe in this whole abstract concept of generations, I think you need to have this other abstract layer of cusping generations to make it a little bit more sensible. And I think I'm going to end the video here because cusps is really what I wanted to get to. There is one other major critique, though, which I'm going to do in the next video because this one's already way too long. And that is the Civil War anomaly, which is the main reason why I read the book. I wanted to know why there was no hero generation in the Civil War. And when I read the book, I really was not satisfied at all with that reason. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there probably very well could be a hero generation during that cycle. And we're going to look at where those years are and what my justification is for creating a whole new generation where Strauss and Howe did not create one. But we shall save that for next time.